The year is 203. A Roman courtroom in Carthage. The procurator Hilarianus sits at the front. Before him stands a young woman. Her father has pushed through the crowd. He is holding her infant son in his arms. He is weeping, and he is begging, "Spare your father." Hilarianus says, "Spare your boy. One gesture. Offer the sacrifice. Go home." The young woman looks at her father. She looks at her son. She looks back at the procurator. She says 4 words. "I am a Christian." Hilarianus sentences her to the beasts. Her name is Perpetua. She is 22 years old. She has weeks to live. And she spends those weeks doing something that Rome, for all its power and all its preparation, had never thought to prevent. She writes. She writes from inside a Roman prison cell, in her own words, in her own hand, recording what is happening to her before anyone else can decide what it means. A diary, a first-person account of fear and grief and vision and faith, written by someone who knows she is going to die and writes anyway. That document has survived for nearly 2,000 years. Rome did not. This is the story of what Perpetua wrote, what it cost her to write it, and why everyone since has been trying to decide what it means. Perpetua was born into a city that had already made its peace with Rome. Carthage, by the year 203, was 3 centuries removed from the war that had nearly broken the empire. The Carthage of Hannibal, of elephants crossing the Alps, of a rivalry so dangerous that Roman senators ended every speech with the same demand, regardless of the topic. That city was ash. Rome had burned it, rebuilt it from the ground up on the same coast, and filled it with Roman streets and Roman law and Roman gods, until the memory of what it had been before was buried under everything Rome needed it to become. By the time Perpetua was born, somewhere around the year 180, Carthage had been Roman for over 3 centuries. It was one of the great cities of the empire, the 3rd or 4th largest in the entire Roman world, a place where ambitious families built careers, where merchants grew wealthy on trade across the Mediterranean, where the children of prosperous households received the same education in Latin rhetoric and philosophy that their counterparts in Rome or Alexandria received. Perpetua was one of those children. Her diary tells us more about her education than it tells us about almost anything else in her background. The Latin, she writes, is precise and literary. She thinks in images drawn from classical culture. She is comfortable with complexity in a way that only comes from years of serious reading. Whatever her exact social standing, and scholars have debated this, she was educated at a level that placed her among the upper layers of Carthaginian society. She had a father, a mother, at least 2 brothers, a husband who disappears from the diary so quickly that some readers have wondered whether he was already dead by the time the arrests happened. Though we cannot know for certain, she was nursing an infant son. He was small enough to still depend on her completely. She was, in other words, exactly the kind of person Rome expected to understand the rules. Here is what the rules were. Rome did not particularly care what you believed in private. The empire was enormous, stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, containing dozens of languages and hundreds of local religious traditions. Rome had no interest in standardizing private belief. What Rome required was public loyalty, expressed through specific rituals that everyone understood were about political order as much as religious devotion. The central ritual was sacrifice. On specific occasions, citizens were expected to offer sacrifice to the Roman gods. And in the years following the emperor, Septimius Severus, increasingly to the genius of the emperor himself. This was not primarily a theological statement. It was a civic statement. It said, I acknowledge the order that makes this city function. I recognize the authority that holds this empire together. I am part of this, not separate from it. For most people in the empire, this was no more demanding than standing for an anthem or signing a loyalty oath. You did it. It meant what it meant in the context of public life. And then you went home to whatever private arrangements you had made with whatever gods you actually believed in. For Christians, it was a different matter entirely, because the claim that the emperor's divine authority was ultimate was precisely the claim that Christianity denied. There was one God, and Caesar was not his name. To offer sacrifice to the genius of the emperor was not just a political gesture. It was, in Christian understanding, a lie about the nature of reality itself. And you could not perform that lie publicly and remain what you were privately. This is the collision that produced Perpetua's story. A collision between two systems that each claimed to be the organizing truth of existence. And that could not both be right. And that could not, finally, share the same public space. Rome understood this better than it is sometimes given credit for. The Roman authorities who dealt with Christian cases were not, for the most part, sadists or fanatics. They were administrators trying to maintain order in a complex, multi-ethnic empire. The records we have of trials from this period, including the record of Perpetua's own trial, suggest officials who were genuinely puzzled by the refusal to perform a simple public gesture that would end the whole problem immediately. Just sacrifice. They kept saying, just this one thing. Go home afterward and believe whatever you want. Nobody is asking you to stop being a Christian in private. And Christians kept refusing, because the point was not the private belief. The point was the public acknowledgement. Rome needed people to say, with their bodies and their presence, that Rome's order was the highest order. Christians could not say that, because it would mean saying that it was not. This is the world Perpetua had grown up in. She had been educated in its values. Her family had status within it. Her father cared deeply about honor and reputation, which were categories that Rome had created and that her family had accepted as real. She understood the system from the inside, which means that her refusal to perform the one ritual that would have kept her alive was not the refusal of someone who did not understand what she was giving up. It was the refusal of someone who understood exactly what she was giving up, and had decided that there was something she was not willing to trade it for. That decision was not made in one moment. It was made over the course of weeks in a Roman prison, with her infant son, with her grieving father, with a group of people who were all facing the same impossible question from different angles. How she made it, and what it cost her, is where this story really begins. Perpetua's diary begins not with a declaration of faith. It begins with her father. He came to her as soon as he heard about the arrest. Not with anger, not with the cold distance of a man who had decided to cut his losses and protect what remained of the family's reputation. He came the way a father comes when the thing he has been afraid of his whole life has finally happened, and he does not know what to do with his hands. He argued with her. He tried every angle he could find. He pointed to her mother. He pointed to her brothers. He pointed to the infant son who still needed to be fed, who still depended on her body to survive. He told her that her stubbornness would destroy not just herself, but everyone who loved her, that the shame of a public execution would follow the family for a generation, that there was no principle worth what she was about to do to the people who had given her everything she had. Perpetua records the conversation in her diary with a quietness that is more unsettling than anger would have been. She does not describe him as wrong. She does not dismiss his love as a manipulation. She simply writes that she told him the truth, the way you tell a truth you wish were not true. She pointed to a water jug sitting nearby. She asked him whether that jug could be called by any other name than what it was. He said no. She said, "Neither can I be called anything other than what I am, a Christian." He left. He did not come back for several days. Read that exchange slowly, because it is doing more than it appears to be doing. Perpetua is not being cold. She is not performing heroic detachment. She is using the most careful logic she has to explain something that she knows her father cannot accept. And she is doing it as gently as the situation allows. The image of the jug is not rhetoric. It is a woman trying to find language for an identity that has become so fundamental to her that she cannot separate herself from it any more than an object can be separated from its nature. Her father heard that and walked away, and she watched him go. What followed was several weeks in a holding prison while the formal legal process moved forward. The conditions were not immediately brutal. Roman prisons of this period varied enormously, and the initial period before trial was sometimes relatively bearable for people with resources or connections. Perpetua had both. Members of her community were able to visit. Food could be brought in. Her infant son was brought to her, and she nursed him in the cell. And she writes that having him there made the prison feel almost like a home compared to what she had feared. That detail matters. It is not incidental locale color. It is Perpetua telling us, in the most concrete physical terms possible, that she was not a person who had transcended the ordinary attachments of human life. She was a mother who found comfort in nursing her child in a prison cell. The faith that was going to cost her everything was not a faith that had made her less human. It had not anesthetized her against the things she loved. The baby was still warm. The milk was still real. And she was still going to face the arena. Her father came back. He came back several times over the following weeks, each time trying a different approach. The diary records at least 3 significant encounters, and each one is harder to read than the last, because the pressure he was applying was not the pressure of tyranny. It was the pressure of love. He was not threatening her. He was falling apart in front of her. At the formal hearing, the moment when the procurator Hilarianus asked each of the accused in turn whether they were Christians, Perpetua's father appeared in the crowd with her infant son in his arms. He pushed toward her. He held the baby out to her. He begged her to have pity on the child, on his old age, on the mother who would not survive losing a daughter, on the brothers whose careers would be damaged by the family's disgrace. "Have pity," he said. "Do not abandon yous all." The procurator leaned in. He had a job to do, but he was also watching a father beg. And whatever else he was a man who understood what that looked like. He said to Perpetua, "Spare your father's white hair. Spare the infancy of your boy. Offer the sacrifice for the welfare of the emperors." Perpetua said no, not with a speech, not with a declaration, just no, I am a Christian. Hilarianus sentenced her to the beasts. Her father was beaten by the court lictors for causing the disruption. Perpetua watched that happen. She records it in her diary in a single sentence. She says she felt pain for him as if she herself had been struck, and she grieved that he had been brought to this by his old age. She felt pain. She records the pain. She does not resolve it or explain it away or transform it into something that fits more neatly into a story of courage. The pain is just there, in the text, exactly the way it happened. This is what makes Perpetua's diary unlike almost anything else from this period. The hagiographic tradition, the literature of saints' lives and martyr accounts that would grow enormously in the centuries after her death, tended to produce figures of serene and luminous certainty. The great martyrs of Christian memory died beautifully. They spoke with authority. They faced the moment of death with a composure that suggested they had already, in some sense, moved beyond ordinary human concern. Perpetua did not die that way, or at least, she did not live the weeks before her death that way. She worried about her son. She ached for her father. She had strange, vivid dreams that she did not fully understand. She was afraid of things and uncertain about things, and deeply, specifically, personally attached to the people she was leaving behind. None of that weakened her decision. It just made it heavier, and Rome had understood this. Or at least Rome's administrators had understood it intuitively. The pressure brought to bear on Perpetua was not random cruelty. It was precisely targeted at the things most likely to break her. Not physical pain. Not yet. Not abstract threats about what would happen to her body. Family. Her father's grief. Her son's helplessness. The specific human bonds that a person who actually loved the people around her could not simply set aside. Rome was right that these were the things most likely to move her. Rome was wrong that they were enough. Because here is what Perpetua understood that her father and Hilarianus and the entire system pressing down on her did not fully grasp. She was not choosing her faith over her family. She was not trading one love for another. She was confronting the question that the situation had forced into the open. The question of whether there was an identity beneath all the roles she occupied. Beneath daughter and mother and wife and citizen. That could not be surrendered without surrendering herself entirely. The jug cannot be called by another name. She was not a person who happened to be a Christian, the way she happened to be a resident of Carthage or a member of a particular family. She was a person for whom the Christian claim about the nature of reality had become the organizing fact of existence. To deny it publicly was not to perform a harmless civic ritual. It was to say that the thing at the center of her was negotiable. And if that was negotiable, what was not? Her father never stopped trying. He came to the prison again, closer to the end. And this time, the diary records something that is almost too painful to read without looking away. He was pulling out his beard. He was throwing himself on the ground. He was saying things that a man only says when he has passed through grief, and come out the other side into something that has no name. He was calling her not daughter but lady. He was begging with the specific desperation of someone who has run out of arguments and is now just trying to reach her with his hands. Perpetua does not write about her own feelings in this scene. She describes what she sees. The white hair, the old body on the ground, the things he says, and then the entry moves on. That silence in the text is not absence. It is the sound of something too large for sentences. She knew what she was doing to him. She knew, and she did it anyway. Not because she did not love him. Not because faith had made her invulnerable to the sight of her father's suffering. But because she had arrived at a place where the only alternatives were to betray herself or to break his heart. And she had decided which of those she could live with. Which is to say, which of those she could die with. Rome could not reach her there. Not because she was beyond feeling, because she had already felt everything Rome was trying to make her feel, and she had stayed anyway. The baby was eventually taken home to be raised by her family. She records this without drama. She simply notes that God arranged it so that the child no longer needed her milk, and that she was no longer in pain for him or troubled by his absence, and that in this she saw the hand of God. Whether you read that as genuine spiritual consolation or as the coping mechanism of a woman who needed to believe that her child would be all right, the result is the same. She let him go, and she picked up the pen again. There is a question that sits underneath everything in Perpetua's diary. A question she never directly addresses, which is probably the reason it keeps asking itself. Why did she write this down? Not in a logistical sense. We know that members of her community had access to her in the prison. We know that writing materials could be obtained. We know that the early Christian communities had strong traditions of letter writing and record keeping, and that documents recording the experiences of those facing persecution were valued and preserved. The mechanics of how a prison diary could exist in the 3rd century are not mysterious. The question is not how. The question is why. She knew she was going to die. She had been sentenced. The date had been set. There was no scenario in which what she was writing would help her survive, influence her trial, or change the outcome of anything that was already in motion. Whatever she put on that page, Rome was not going to read it and reconsider. So who was she writing for? This is a question that scholars have circled for centuries without landing on a single answer. And the fact that there is no single answer is itself one of the most important things about the diary, because the uncertainty of audience is part of what makes Perpetua's voice feel different from almost every other document we have from early Christianity. When Paul wrote his letters, he was writing to specific communities with specific problems. He knew his audience. He was making arguments designed for particular ears. When the authors of the Gospels composed their accounts of Jesus' life, they were writing for communities that needed a coherent narrative of what they believed and why. When later Christians wrote accounts of martyrs, they were writing for the edification of the faithful, to inspire and instruct and demonstrate the power of grace under pressure. All of those texts have a purpose that precedes the writing. The writing is in service of something else. Perpetua's diary is not like that. Or rather, it is not only like that. There are moments when she seems to be writing for her community, preserving details that will matter to the people who will read this after she is gone. There are moments when she seems to be writing for herself, working through experiences and feelings on the page, the way a person uses writing to understand what they are living through. There are moments that feel addressed to God, or to the tradition she is entering, or to some future reader she cannot see. And there are moments that feel addressed to no one, that have the quality of a person speaking into a room they are not sure anyone is in. That range of registers, that uncertainty about who is listening, is what gives the diary its particular texture. It does not feel like a document designed to achieve something. It feels like a document that was written because writing was the only tool available for doing something that needed to be done. What needed to be done? Think about Perpetua's situation from a perspective that is not primarily about theology or martyrdom. She is a young woman who has been arrested, tried, and condemned. Every authority in her world has been brought to bear on her to define what is happening to her. Her father is defining it as tragedy. As a daughter, throwing away everything good in her life for nothing. The Roman court is defining it as the just punishment of someone who has refused to fulfill her civic obligations. The Christian community around her is almost certainly defining it as witness, as the opportunity to demonstrate the truth of the faith in the most visible possible terms. Everyone around her is writing the story of what is happening to Perpetua, and Perpetua picks up a pen and writes her own. This is not a small thing. In the 3rd century, first-person accounts of inner experience were not common. The philosophical tradition had produced works of self-reflection. Marcus Aurelius was writing his own private meditations in roughly the same period. But those were the products of men at the pinnacle of Roman power, writing for themselves in Greek. The idea of a young woman in a provincial prison recording her dreams and her conversations with her father and her thoughts about her infant son in real time, with no apparent agenda beyond the record itself, is genuinely unusual. What Perpetua produces is something that the historian Elizabeth Castelli has described as a text that insists on its own subjectivity. It refuses to disappear into the category it is supposed to occupy. A martyr account is supposed to be about the triumph of faith over fear. Perpetua's account is about a person who is afraid and grieving and uncertain and deeply attached to the people she is losing, and who is moving through all of that toward a death she has chosen, without pretending that the choosing is easy. That refusal to simplify, that insistence on recording the full complexity of what she is experiencing, is what makes the diary an act of something more than documentation. Consider what she includes that she did not have to include. She did not have to write about her father pulling out his beard and throwing himself on the ground. That detail is not edifying in any obvious sense. It does not make her look heroic. It makes her look like a person who is causing her father enormous pain and who knows it. A writer with an agenda. A writer who wanted to produce a clean narrative of faithful witness. Would leave that out or transform it into something more comfortable. She leaves it in. She did not have to write about the relief she felt when her son no longer needed her milk. That is a biological fact about her body, not a theological statement. It does not advance any argument about the power of faith. It is just something that happened to her, something her body did, something that made the separation from her child slightly less impossible to bear. She puts it in. She did not have to write about her confusion in the visions, the moments when she did not know what she was seeing or what it meant. A document designed to demonstrate spiritual confidence would not include the writer's uncertainty. Perpetua includes it because it was true, because it happened, because apparently the record mattered to her more than the impression the record might create. This is what I mean when I say the diary is an act of something more than documentation. There is a difference between being remembered and speaking for yourself. The early Christian tradition was very good at remembering its martyrs. There was a whole genre of literature dedicated to it. Martyrdoms were recorded, circulated, read on the feast days of the saints who had died in them. The community kept its dead alive through story. But those stories were told by the living. for the living, and they served the purposes of the living. They took the deaths of real people and shaped them into lessons, into examples, into evidence for claims about the nature of faith and the power of God. In doing so, they preserved something. They also inevitably transformed something. Perpetua knew this, not necessarily in those analytical terms, but she knew it in the practical sense that every person in a dramatic situation knows that the story of what is happening to them will be told by others, and that what those others tell will reflect what they need the story to mean. The only way to protect the record, the only way to ensure that at least some version of what actually happened to her included her own account of what it felt like from the inside, was to write it herself. Rome could decide the date and manner of her death. It could not decide what her death meant to the person dying. That is what the pen was for. The diary, as we have it, is not entirely Perpetua's work. The text that has come down to us includes a preface written by an editor, a section of visions recorded by Satyrus, one of the men condemned with her, and a closing narrative of the events in the arena written by someone who was present. We will return to those additions and what they tell us about how the story was shaped after her death. But the core sections, the sections in which Perpetua speaks in her own first-person voice, are something that no editor added. They exist because she wrote them. And what they preserve is not a saint or a symbol or a lesson. They preserve a person who was 22 years old and had a baby, and a father who loved her, and a faith that meant more to her than her own life, and who sat in a Roman prison and wrote down what that felt like before anyone else had the chance to decide what it meant. That decision, to write rather than to wait for others to write about her, is the thing that separates Perpetua from thousands of other martyrs whose names we know and whose voices we have never heard. Rome could stage her death, but Perpetua had already begun staging its meaning. There is a part of the diary that makes modern readers uncomfortable in a way that is different from the discomfort of reading about a young mother choosing death. The visions. 4 times during her weeks in prison, Perpetua records experiences that she describes as dreams, but treats as something more than dreams. She asks for them. She receives them. She analyzes them. She draws conclusions from them that affect how she understands her situation and what she believes is going to happen to her. The modern reader arrives at these sections with a set of reflexes that are almost impossible to suspend. The secular reader reaches for psychological explanation. The religious reader reaches for theological category. The historian reaches for comparative material from other ancient dream traditions. Everyone, in other words, arrives with a framework already in hand, ready to place what Perpetua saw inside something familiar. What I want to suggest is that the most interesting thing about the visions is not what they contain, it is what they do. Because when you read the 4 visions in sequence, something becomes visible that gets lost when you read each one in isolation. There is a movement, a direction. The person who has the first vision is not the same person who has the 4th, and the difference between them tells you something about what was happening inside Perpetua during those weeks that no external account could have captured. The first vision begins with a request. Her brother Dinocrates, not the one who had died young. She had another brother among those arrested with her, asked her to ask for a vision. To ask, the way you ask for something you believe is available to you, but are not certain you deserve. Perpetua prayed, and that night she saw a bronze ladder. The ladder was narrow. It reached from the earth to the sky. On either side of it, pressed against the rungs, were weapons, swords, élans, hooks, daggers. If you tried to climb carelessly, or quickly, or without attention, the metal would cut you. At the base of the ladder, coiled and enormous, was a dragon. It was waiting, not actively attacking, just waiting, in the way that the thing you are most afraid of waits for you at the beginning of the hardest thing you have ever tried to do. A man named Satyrus, one of the others condemned with her, had already climbed the ladder in the vision. He was at the top, looking down. He called to her, "Be careful," he said. "Do not let the dragon bite you." Perpetua looked at the dragon. She stepped on its head. She climbed. At the top she found a garden. A white-haired man in shepherd's clothing. Thousands of people in white. Cheese. He gave her some. She ate it. The people around her said, "Amen." And she woke up. The interpretation she offers is immediate and practical. She says she understood from this that she would not be fighting against wild beasts, but against the devil, and that she knew she would win. She moves on. Do not move on with her. Stay in the image for a moment. The dragon at the base of the ladder is the thing that is supposed to stop her before she begins. Not at the top, not as a final test, but at the very first step. The fear comes first. The fear is the obstacle, not the climb itself. And the way past the fear is not to wait for it to move, not to find a route around it, not to pretend it is not there. The way past it is to step on its head and climb. She does not describe herself as unafraid. She describes herself as moving despite the fear. Those are not the same thing. This matters enormously for how we understand the rest of the diary. Perpetua is not a person who had been granted supernatural immunity to fear. She is a person who was afraid and who kept moving. The vision is not a promise that the dragon will be destroyed before she encounters it. It is a record of her own mind working out, in the language of dream and symbol, what it looks like to face the thing you cannot avoid facing. The second and third visions involve her brother Dinocrates, the one who had died as a child from a cancerous facial wound. She sees him suffering, thirsty, unable to reach water. She prays for him. Days later she sees him again, healed, playing, the wound gone, with all the water he needs. These are the most personal passages in the entire diary. There is no theology here that serves any obvious argumentative purpose. There is a sister who lost a brother when she was young, who is now facing her own death, and who is apparently spending part of her prayer time in prison, thinking about a child who died badly before he had lived long enough to deserve it. The grief in these passages is real and old, and has nothing to do with her current situation, except that facing death of your own has a way of bringing every other death back to the surface. She does not editorialize. She records what she saw, and what changed, and what she understood from it. She moves on again. But those two brief sections of the diary are doing something that the more dramatic passages cannot do. They are showing us a person who contains more than her present crisis. A person with a history, with old losses, with the particular kind of love that does not end when the person it is directed at is gone. The visions about Dinocrates are not evidence of Perpetua's faith. They are evidence of Perpetua's humanity. And in a document that has been read for centuries, primarily as a record of extraordinary faith, that humanity is easy to read past. The fourth vision is the one that has generated the most commentary, and for good reason. The night before the games, someone comes to Perpetua. An Egyptian man, large and strong, comes to fight her. Her supporters come to help prepare her, rubbing oil on her skin, the way athletes were prepared before competition. And then something happens that she records without particular emphasis, as if it was simply something that occurred. She becomes a man, not metaphorically. The diary says she became male. Her supporters stripped her, and she was male. She fought the Egyptian. She won. She stepped on his head, the way she had stepped on the dragon in the first vision. The crowd cheered. A man with silver hair and the bearing of a lanista, a trainer of gladiators, told her, "Peace be with you, daughter." She walked through the gate of life, and she woke up and understood that she would not be fighting wild beasts but the devil, and that she would win. The gender transformation has been interpreted in more ways than can be summarized here. Some scholars read it as evidence that the categories of male and female in early Christian thought were understood to be transcended in the spiritual realm, that in Christ there is neither male nor female. As Paul had written, some read it as Perpetua's own imagination reaching for the only image of physical power and competitive victory that her culture had given her, which was male. Some read it as an expression of something more personal, a woman who had spent weeks refusing the roles her society had defined for her finding in the dream space of vision, a body that was simply not subject to those definitions at all. What all of these readings share is the recognition that the transformation is significant. Perpetua records it without apology or explanation. She does not note that it was strange. She does not pause to clarify what she means or to reassure a reader who might find it confusing. She simply says, "I became male. I fought. I won. And now I know what is going to happen." This is a woman who has spent weeks being defined by others. Her father's daughter, the infant's mother, the court's defendant, the community's witness, the empire's problem. In the fourth vision, she is none of those things. She is a fighter in the arena, and she wins. The arc of the four visions, from the first where she climbs, despite the dragon, to the fourth where she fights and defeats the adversary directly, is not a random sequence of unrelated experiences. It is a record of a person moving through something, processing something, arriving somewhere. At the beginning of her imprisonment, the way forward involved fear and careful navigation. By the end, it involved direct confrontation. At the beginning, she was climbing a ladder past weapons. By the end, she was in the arena, and the arena was not a place of defeat. This is what the visions are doing, not providing supernatural reassurance from outside, mapping the interior movement of a person who is preparing, in the deepest available sense of that word, for what is coming. Rome had sentenced her body. The visions were where she was deciding what that sentence meant, and she had decided it did not mean what Rome intended. Perpetua is not alone in this story. This is easy to forget because the diary is hers, because her voice is the one that survived, because the weight of the narrative falls on her in the way that a first-person account necessarily weights the person writing it. But there is another woman in the prison, another woman facing the arena, another mother who will walk into that space on the same morning and face the same crowd and refuse the same submission. Her name is Felicity. And in almost every way that matters in the world, these two women inhabit. She and Perpetua are opposites. Perpetua is freeborn. Felicity is a slave. Perpetua has education, social standing, a family with enough resources to bring her food in prison, and enough connections to arrange for her son to be cared for. Felicity has none of that. In the legal and social world of Roman Carthage, Felicity does not have the standing to own property, to enter contracts, to make decisions about her own body. She is property, whatever she believes, whatever she has chosen. The framework of Roman law sees her not as a person making a choice, but as an object that has become inconvenient. She is also pregnant when she is arrested. Roman law did not permit the execution of pregnant women, not out of mercy toward the woman herself, but because the unborn child was considered a separate person who had not been condemned and could not be punished for the mother's crime. The law required that Felicity be held until she gave birth, and then executed separately, after the others in her group had already been killed. Felicity does not want this. The account preserved around Perpetua's diary records that the group prayed together 2 days before the games, that Felicity would give birth in time, not so that she would be spared, so that she would not be separated from her companions, so that she would not face the arena alone, after everyone else she had shared this with was already dead. 2 days before the games were scheduled, Felicity went into labor, premature, in the prison, without the support that women were supposed to have when they gave birth, without the rituals and the female attendants that made a dangerous biological event slightly less dangerous. She was in pain. She cried out. One of the prison guards mocked her. "If you cannot bear this," he said, "what are you going to do in the arena when the beasts come?" Felicity said, "Now it is I who suffer. In the arena, another will be in me who will suffer for me, because I am going to suffer for him." The child was delivered, a girl. She was taken in by a Christian woman to be raised as her own, and Felicity was ready. Hold these two women side by side for a moment, because the pairing is not accidental. The account that preserves both of their stories has arranged them together deliberately, and the arrangement is making an argument. Perpetua has everything the Roman world values: education, status, a father who is willing to humiliate himself publicly to save her, a community that can care for her son. She is the kind of person whose death means something in Roman social terms, whose execution carries a visible cost, whose refusal to submit is a legible act of defiance by someone with something to lose. Felicity has nothing the Roman world values. She is a slave. Her child was born in a prison and given away immediately. Nobody in the Roman social hierarchy is going to miss her in the way that Perpetua's father will miss his daughter. Her death carries no social cost for Rome whatsoever. She is, by every measure the Roman world has for measuring people, insignificant, and she is going to walk into the same arena. On the same morning, in the same act of refusal, the Christian account of what happened wants you to see this. It wants you to understand that the category of person who refused Rome's claim was not defined by the categories Rome used to sort people, not by education or status or gender or legal standing. Perpetua and Felicity are together in this story because they represent the breadth of what was happening, the range of people for whom this choice was real, and they are together in the arena because what they share is the only thing that matters to the account. They both said no. The morning of the games was the birthday of Geta Caesar. Public games on the birthday of a member of the imperial family were celebrations of Roman order. The crowd that filled the arena was not simply an audience for violence. It was a civic body, assembled to witness the performance of empire. The executions were part of the program, part of the demonstration that Rome's authority was real, and that those who defied it paid a price that everyone could see. The condemned were brought out. The men were to be given to leopards and bears. Perpetua and Felicity were to be given to a maddened heifer. The choice of animal was not random. Roman spectacle was carefully staged, and the details of what happened to whom were chosen for effect. A heifer was selected because it matched the sex of the condemned. The pairing was designed to add humiliation to punishment, to make the death not just painful, but visually degrading, to give the crowd a spectacle of women being destroyed by something from the natural order of things. Perpetua and Felicity were stripped and brought in nets into the arena. The crowd recoiled. Even a crowd assembled to watch public executions had its own sense of what was appropriate spectacle. And the sight of a young woman who had clearly recently given birth being brought in this way was enough to produce an audible reaction. The account records that the crowd protested, and that the two women were taken out and brought back in more conventional garments. Then the heifer came. Perpetua was thrown first. She hit the ground hard. She got up. And then she did something that the account records as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and which is in fact one of the most precise and resonant images in the entire story. She looked around, not for escape, not for help. She looked around the way a person looks around when they have just been knocked down and need to take stock of where they are and what is happening. And then she noticed that her hair was coming loose. The pin had been knocked free when she fell. Her hair was falling around her face. She gathered it up and pinned it back. The arena crowd was watching. The guards were watching. Hilarianos, who had sentenced her, was watching from his seat, and Perpetua stood up from the dirt of the arena floor and fixed her hair. Why does this matter? Because in the world Perpetua inhabited, a Roman woman's hair carried specific social meaning. Loose hair on a woman was the mark of mourning, of dishonor, of a person in distress. Undone by circumstances, a woman at her own humiliation was supposed to have loose hair. The visual language of the arena expected it. The spectacle required it. The theater of Roman public punishment was built on the premise that what the crowd witnessed was someone being reduced to their most exposed and helpless state. Perpetua stood up and refused the visual. She was not in mourning. She was not in dishonor. She was not going to give the crowd, or the arena, or the empire, the image of a woman coming apart. She pinned her hair back because she was not undone, and the act of pinning her hair back, in that moment, in that place, in front of that crowd, was a statement that required no words. She then looked for Felicity. Felicity had been thrown and was on the ground. Perpetua went to her and helped her up. The account says they stood together, two women, in the middle of the arena, in the middle of a public execution designed to demonstrate Rome's dominance over those who defied it. Standing, the crowd had gone strangely quiet. What Rome had prepared was a spectacle of defeat, a demonstration that the bodies of those who refused submission could be taken and broken and made into a lesson for everyone watching. The entire architecture of the event, the choice of animals, The arrangement of the program, the presence of the city's officials in their seats, was designed to produce a specific meaning. The two women standing in the middle of it were producing a different one. There is a moment in the account, after the heifer attack and before the executions by sword, where Perpetua is described as being in a kind of spiritual transport, so absorbed in what she was experiencing internally that she was not fully present to the physical events around her. She came to herself afterward and seemed not to believe she had been attacked at all, until she was shown the marks on her body. The account presents this as evidence of divine grace, of the presence of God shielding her from the full experience of what was happening to her body. It may be that. It may also be something that people who have been in situations of extreme physical danger sometimes describe a dissociation from the physical that allows the mind to remain coherent when the body is in crisis. The two explanations are not mutually exclusive. Perpetua would not have distinguished between them. She would simply have said something was holding me. After the animals had finished, the condemned were moved to the center of the arena for the final executions. A gladiator, young and apparently nervous, was assigned to Perpetua. His first stroke did not land cleanly. She cried out, not from fear, but from pain, from the specific shock of a blade hitting bone. Then, the account says, she took the young man's trembling hand and guided it to her own throat. This image has been carried in Christian memory for nearly 2,000 years, and it should be, because what it represents is remarkable, not passive endurance, not the quiet acceptance of what is being done to her, a woman guiding the instrument of her own death, because the person holding it cannot bring himself to complete what he has been assigned to do. Rome needed someone to be defeated in that arena. What it got was someone who was still, in the final moment, directing the action. The account closes its description of the scene with a line that reads differently depending on where you are standing. It says that perhaps so great a woman could not have been killed except that she herself had willed it. Perhaps so great a woman could not have been killed except that she herself had willed it. Rome could stage the death, but even the people watching acknowledged, in that sentence, that the meaning of the death was not Rome's to give. Perpetua stopped writing before the end. This is not a small detail. It is the first thing you notice when you look at the structure of the document that has come down to us. The text called the Passio Perpetuae et Felicitatis, the Passion of Perpetua and Felicity. The diary in Perpetua's own voice ends before the arena. It ends with the fourth vision, with the dream of the gladiatorial combat and the gate of life and the understanding that she would win. And then her voice stops. Someone else picks up the account. Someone who was there, or who gathered testimony from those who were there, and who completed the record that Perpetua had begun. This person describes the morning of the games, the procession into the arena, the heifer, the sword, the details that Perpetua could not write because she did not survive them. And this same person, or someone closely connected to them, also wrote the beginning. The text opens with a preface that is not Perpetua's voice. It is a careful, theologically sophisticated introduction that frames everything that follows. It tells the reader that new examples of virtue are as useful as old ones, that the Holy Spirit continues to work in every age, that what is about to be read is not merely historical record, but living proof of divine grace. It quotes scripture. It makes arguments. It places Perpetua's diary inside a specific theological project before the reader has encountered a single word of the diary itself. The voice of the preface is not Perpetua's voice. It is the voice of someone who has read her diary and decided how it should be received. Who was this person? The question has occupied scholars for a very long time, and it has not been definitively answered. The most frequently proposed candidate is Tertullian, the great theological writer of Carthage, who was active in exactly this period and whose Latin style shares certain characteristics with the preface. Tertullian was not a neutral figure in the Christianity of his time. He was a man of strong and specific convictions, including a deep sympathy for the Montanist movement, a charismatic tendency within Christianity that placed enormous emphasis on prophecy, vision, and the direct experience of the Holy Spirit. If Tertullian wrote the preface, and this remains an if that scholars treat with appropriate caution, then the framing of Perpetua's diary was not a neutral act of preservation. It was an act with a theological agenda. The Montanist argument was that the Spirit continued to speak directly through living believers, that the age of prophecy was not closed, that the institutional church should not be the sole arbiter of divine communication. Perpetua's visions were exactly the kind of evidence that argument needed. Her diary, in Montanist hands, became proof of a theological position she had never explicitly argued for. This is worth sitting with, not because it means the diary was falsified. The core of what Perpetua wrote appears to be genuinely hers. The text shows every sign of authentic first-person composition, the particular quality of attention, the specific details that serve no obvious rhetorical purpose, the emotional register that does not resolve neatly into edification. Nothing in the scholarly consensus suggests that anyone invented Perpetua's words. But framing is not falsification. You can preserve every word someone wrote and still shape how those words are received by what you put around them. The preface tells the reader what kind of document this is before they have read a line of it. It tells them what to look for and what it means when they find it. It is, in the most literal sense, an act of interpretation that precedes the text it is interpreting. Perpetua wrote before others could speak for her. The editor was faster than Rome. He got to her words before the reader did. The text spread quickly after her death. It was read in the churches of North Africa with an authority that made some in the established hierarchy uncomfortable. Augustine, preaching in Carthage more than 2 centuries after Perpetua's death, felt the need to address the matter directly. He praised her, he honored her martyrdom, and then he made a careful distinction between her diary and the canonical scriptures, explaining that while her account was edifying and worthy of respect, it was not to be placed on the same level as the writings included in the Bible. The fact that Augustine felt the need to make this distinction tells you something. It tells you that people were reading Perpetua's diary with a kind of authority that the institutional church was not entirely comfortable with, that her first-person voice, her direct claim to visionary experience, her account of her own encounter with the divine, was being received as something more than a historical document. It was being received as revelation, and the church, which had spent considerable effort defining the boundaries of revelation, had complicated feelings about a young woman from Carthage sitting inside those boundaries with a prison diary. In the centuries that followed, the story of Perpetua was absorbed into the calendar of saints, and the practice of veneration in ways that both honored her and contained her. She became a feast day, the 7th of March, a fixed point in the liturgical calendar where her story would be remembered, read aloud, held up as example. Churches were dedicated to her name across North Africa and eventually much further. Her name entered the canon of the Roman Mass, the central prayer of Catholic worship, where it has remained for more than 1,000 years. This is extraordinary honor. It is also a specific kind of honor. The saint in the calendar is not quite the same person as the young woman in the diary. The saint is stable. She has a feast day and a fixed meaning and a place in the liturgical order that does not change. Her story has been processed by centuries of theological reflection and liturgical use and artistic representation until it has taken on the smooth contours of something that fits comfortably inside a tradition that knows what to do with it. The young woman in the diary is not stable. She is uncertain and grieving and afraid and stubbornly. Specifically, uncomplicatedly herself in a way that does not fit comfortably inside any single framework. She is a person, not a symbol, and persons are harder to manage than symbols. The artist traditions that developed around Perpetua tended to emphasize specific elements of her story while quietly de-emphasizing others. The courage in the arena, the spiritual visions, the peaceful acceptance of martyrdom, the image of a woman whose faith was so strong that suffering could not reach her, the image of a woman who fixed her hair after being thrown by a heifer, who guided a trembling gladiator's hand, who spent weeks in prison aching over a father who could not understand her, who felt relief when her son no longer needed her milk, who recorded her dead brother's suffering with the grief of a sister who had never quite let him go. Those details are all in the text. They have always been in the text. And they are the details that the saint's calendar, for all its preservation of her name, could not quite hold, because a saint is someone whose story the tradition has decided it knows how to tell. And Perpetua, in the diary she left behind, is someone whose story keeps exceeding what the tradition decided it knew. Tertullian, if it was indeed Tertullian who wrote the preface, preserved Perpetua's voice because it served his theological purposes. The communities that read her diary in the following centuries preserved it because it moved them. The church that placed her in the calendar of saints preserved her name because her death was genuinely remarkable. The scribes who copied the manuscript through the medieval period preserved it because they understood they were handling something worth keeping. Every act of preservation was also an act of interpretation. Every generation that kept her story alive also shaped what the story meant. This is not a crime. It is not a conspiracy. It is what happens to every important text that survives long enough to matter to more than one community. The question is not whether the shaping happened. It clearly did. The question is what, in the process of all that shaping, remained untouched. And the answer is the diary. Not because the diary is beyond interpretation. Nothing is beyond interpretation. But because the diary was written before the interpretations began. And what it contains is not a portrait of a saint or a lesson for the faithful or evidence for a theological argument. It is a record of what one person thought and felt and saw and understood during the weeks between her arrest and her death. That record has been carried inside a tradition that did not always know what to do with it. It has survived anyway. Go back to the beginning. Not to Carthage. Not to the prison. Further back than that. Back to the question this story has been carrying since the first time someone sat down and tried to make sense of what Perpetua left behind. Whose story is this? It seems like it should have a simple answer. She wrote it. It is hers. The diary is Perpetua's story in the most literal possible sense, written in her hand, in her words, from inside her experience. If a story can ever belong to anyone, this one belongs to her. But a story does not live only in the moment of its writing. It lives in every reading. And the readings of Perpetua's diary have produced not one story, but many. And the many versions of the story do not always recognize each other. And none of them is entirely wrong. And none of them is entirely complete. Consider what the different traditions have done with her. The Christian devotional tradition has carried her for nearly 2,000 years as a martyr and a saint, a woman whose death demonstrated the power of faith to transcend the worst that the world can do to a person. This reading is not wrong. It is supported by everything in the text. She was a Christian. She died for her faith. The courage she demonstrated in the arena was real. The faith that sustained her through the weeks in prison was real. But this reading tends to place the emphasis on the end of the story and work backward from it. It begins with the conclusion, the martyr's death, and reads the diary as preparation for that conclusion. The fears and the uncertainties and the grief over her father and the relief about her son become stages on the way to the culminating act. They are meaningful because they lead to the arena, not because they are true in themselves. Perpetua, in the diary, does not know she is on the way to the arena. She knows the sentence has been passed. But the diary is not written from the perspective of someone who has already reached the end and is looking back. It is written in real time, day by day, with the specific quality of attention that belongs to a person who does not yet know exactly how the days ahead will feel. The feminist scholarly tradition has carried her differently. In this reading, what matters most is what Perpetua represents as a historical phenomenon, a woman in the 3rd century who wrote her own account of her own experience, who refused the identities that her society assigned her, who appeared in her own vision as a male fighter and won. This reading has given us some of the most valuable scholarly work done on Perpetua in the last 50 years. It has restored her to the history of women's writing and women's religious experience with a seriousness and care that the purely devotional tradition sometimes missed. But this reading also has its own emphases and its own silences. The Perpetua of feminist scholarship is sometimes more interested in gender and resistance and the politics of identity than in the specific theological content of what she believed. The Christian claim that was the actual reason for her arrest and her death can become, in some versions of this reading, a kind of vehicle for something the reading finds more interesting, which is the question of female agency in a patriarchal world. Perpetua, in the diary, does not seem primarily interested in that question. She is interested in what she believes and what it requires of her. The gender of her experience matters to her, but it is not the organizing framework of the diary. The faith is. The psychological reading has produced its own portrait. The visions, in this tradition, are symptoms as much as experiences. The dissociation in the arena is a trauma response. The transformation into a male fighter in the 4th vision is a product of psychological pressure. The composure with which Perpetua faces death is, in some versions of this reading, not faith, but a collapse of the normal self-preserving responses under conditions of extreme stress. These readings are not worthless. The psychological dimension of what Perpetua experienced is real and worth taking seriously. But a reading that explains the visions away as symptoms has lost something that the text insists on. Perpetua believed they were real. She acted on them as if they were real, and the person who acts on a belief is not fully explained by a theory about why the belief arose. Each of these readings sees something in Perpetua that is genuinely there. Each of them also misses something. The devotional reading misses the uncertainty. The feminist reading sometimes misses the faith. The psychological reading often misses the agency. And all of them, in different ways, risk doing what the editor of the diary did, placing a framework around Perpetua's voice before the reader has encountered it, deciding in advance what kind of document this is and what kind of person it describes. Here is what I think is actually true. With the appropriate honesty about the limits of what any of us can know about a person who has been dead for 18 centuries, Perpetua was a young woman of education and status in a Roman colonial city who had converted to a faith that required her to make a public claim her world would not tolerate. She was arrested. She was given multiple opportunities to recant. She refused. She spent several weeks in prison, during which she cared for her son and grieved over her father, and had visionary experiences she found meaningful, and wrote down everything she was able to write down before the day she could no longer write anything. She was 22 years old. She was afraid. She was also, by every measure the diary provides, completely clear about what she was doing and why. Those two things can coexist: fear and clarity, grief and conviction, love for her father and the inability to give him what he needed, the milk of her body going to her son in a prison cell, and the knowledge that the child would have to grow up without her. These are not contradictions that need to be resolved. They are the texture of a life being lived at the point where everything that matters is pressing in from every direction at once. The tradition that preserved her story needed it to mean something specific. The theology needed her to be a saint. The feminist scholarship needed her to be a symbol of resistance. The psychology needed her to be a case study. And she is all of those things. And also none of them completely. Because she was a person. And persons exceed the categories we use to contain them. What she left behind, in the pages she wrote before anyone else could write about her, is not a lesson. It is not evidence for a theological argument. It is not a symbol of anything, though it has become symbolic of many things. It is the record of a person thinking and feeling and deciding and surviving for as long as she was able to survive, on her own terms. Now ask the question that this story has been building toward. If Perpetua wrote her own story, and then died, and then generations of readers preserved and shaped and interpreted and argued over what she wrote, what is left that is actually hers? The answer is both simpler and stranger than it might seem. The words are hers, not the framing the editor placed around them, not the theological use the tradition made of them, not the symbolic weight that centuries of veneration have given them. The words themselves. In the Latin she wrote, in the sentences she constructed in a Roman prison in the year 203, are hers, and they have been sitting there, inside all the interpretations, waiting for each new reader to encounter them directly, not through the saint's calendar or the scholarly argument or the theological framework, though all of those things are part of how the words have traveled to us. Just the words. The brother on the ground with water he cannot reach. the dragon at the base of the ladder, and the step that had to be taken, the father's white hair, the baby, the pin holding the hair in place in the middle of the arena. Rome wanted her to be afraid. It needed her to perform her own submission in front of the crowd, to confirm that the order it had built was stronger than the conviction she carried. It brought every tool it had to bear on producing that performance. Her father, her son, the legal machinery of the empire, the theater of the arena. And she wrote instead. She wrote before Rome could stage her death. She wrote before the editor could frame her vision. She wrote before the theologians could argue over her legacy, and the scholars could debate her gender, and the calendar could fix her into a feast day. She wrote when the only audience she could be certain of was herself, and whatever she believed was listening beyond herself. That writing is still here. The diary has traveled 18 centuries through fires and wars and the collapse of empires and the rise of new ones. Through monastic scriptoria and scholarly editions and digital archives. It has been translated into dozens of languages. It has been read by people who believed it was the word of God, and by people who thought it was evidence of mass delusion, and by people who found in it a mirror for experiences of their own that they had never seen reflected anywhere else. Every one of those readers brought something to it. Every one of them found something in it that was already there, and at the center of all of that, unchanged by the centuries of reading, is a young woman in a Roman prison who picked up a pen because she understood something that Rome, for all its power, had not understood. You can decide when a person dies. You cannot decide what their death means. She decided that, in the only way that could not be taken back, before the arena, before the sword, before the saint and the symbol and the scholarly argument and the feast day, she wrote it down. Her name was Perpetua, and she spoke first.